Could you please help this new channel by liking and subscribing? As you see, most of you listening are not subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. Thank you so much. It was supposed to be a typical Friday night. Just me, the TV, and a big old bowl of popcorn. My parents had taken my little sister out for a fancy dinner, leaving me blissfully alone in the quiet, empty house. Sure, they had lectured me for what felt like the 100th time about not opening the door for strangers, but I figured I was old enough to handle a few hours on my own without incident. As I settled in on the couch, the opening credits of my favorite horror movie flickering on the screen, there was a sudden knock at the front door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe it was just the mailman or a neighbor, I told myself. But something in the back of my mind was screaming at me not to even think about answering it. Cautiously, I crept over to the window, peeking through the curtains to get a glimpse of who was on the other side. What I saw made my blood run cold. Not one, but 3 figures lurking on the porch, their faces obscured by the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized one of them. It was my buddy James from down the street, or at least it looked like him. Panic started to set in as I realized this was no innocent visit from a friendly neighbor. These men were up to no good, and they were targeting my house. I frantically tried to think of what to do, my mind racing a mile a minute. Should I call the police? Hide somewhere and hope they went away? Or maybe I could sneak out the back door and make a run for it. As the trio knocked again, more insistently this time, I found myself frozen in fear, my feet seemingly glued to the floor. I watched, helpless, as James called out, his voice muffled through the thick wood of the door. "Hey, man, it's me. Open up, will ya?" I knew it was a lie, a ploy to get me to let my guard down. There was no way James would be out here with 2 other strangers, especially not on a Friday night when he was usually busy with his own family. No, this was something much more sinister. Clutching the edge of the curtain, I backed away from the window, my eyes darting around the room for anything I could use to defend myself. But the house felt so empty, so exposed, with my parents and sister gone. I was on my own, a sitting duck for these would-be intruders. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and I flinched with every thud, certain that any moment now, the door would come crashing down. I had to do something, anything, to get myself out of this nightmare. But the fear had its icy grip on me, robbing me of any semblance of rational thought. Just when I thought I couldn't take the suspense any longer, the knocking suddenly stopped. Holding my breath, I crept back to the window, peering out cautiously. To my relief, the 3 men were gone, vanished into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. I let out a shaky sigh, my knees feeling like they might give out at any moment. I had to get out of this house, had to find somewhere safe to hide until my parents got back. But as I turned to make a break for the back door, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. There in the shadows of the hallway was a figure, tall, imposing, and unmistakably human. My heart nearly stopped as I realized they had somehow managed to get inside, to slip past me while I was frozen in fear at the window. Panic gripped me as I scrambled to find something, anything, that I could use as a weapon. But the house felt so empty, so devoid of anything remotely helpful. I was trapped, a sitting duck in my own home. The figure moved closer, their footsteps slow and deliberate, and I found myself backing away, my back pressed against the wall. This was it, I realized with a sinking feeling. This was how it all ended, with me cowering in my own living room, at the mercy of some twisted intruder. As the figure stepped into the dim light, I felt the breath leave my lungs. It was one of the men from the porch, his face now clearly visible. He grinned at me, a twisted, predatory smile that made my skin crawl. Well, he said, his voice low and menacing. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little party crasher." I opened my mouth to scream, to call for help, but no sound came out. I was completely paralyzed, my mind racing with a million terrifying thoughts about what this man and his cohorts had in store for me. In that moment, I knew that my life would never be the same. Whatever happened next, I would be forever scarred by this experience, this violation of the very place I had always felt safest. And as the man advanced towards me, I braced myself for the worst, praying that somehow, someway, I would make it through the night. Just me, my cousin Lily, and a whole lot of nothing to do. Our mom had run out to the corner store to grab some bread, leaving us home alone for what she insisted would only be a quick errand. As Lily and I plopped down on the couch, idly flipping through the TV channels, a sudden knock at the front door made us both jump. My heart raced as I turned to Lily, silently pleading with her not to answer it. We were just kids, barely teenagers, and the thought of a stranger on the other side of that door sent a chill down my spine. Thankfully, Lily seemed to understand my unspoken panic, and she remained glued to the sofa, her eyes fixed on the door as the knocking grew more insistent. We sat there, frozen, waiting with bated breath for the persistent visitor to give up and leave. But they didn't. Instead, the knocks turned into muffled shouts, a desperate voice calling out, begging to be let in. I felt the color drain from my face as I strained to make out the words, my mind conjuring up a million terrifying scenarios. Suddenly there was a loud crack, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. My eyes went wide with horror as I realized the person on the other side was trying to force their way in, to break down the door and gain entry to our home. Without a moment's hesitation, I grabbed Lily's arm, yanking her off the couch and dragging her towards the kitchen. We had to get out of there, had to find a place to hide before the intruder gained access to the rest of the house. As we rounded the corner, I saw it. The old landline phone sitting on the counter, its cord trailing down the wall. Without a second thought, I snatched it up, my fingers trembling as I dialed the emergency number. The operator's voice on the other end was calm and collected, a stark contrast to the sheer panic coursing through my veins. I managed to choke out our address and a brief explanation of the situation, pleading with her to send help immediately. Just as I hung up the phone, a loud crash echoed through the house, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps. Lily let out a terrified whimper, and I quickly clamped a hand over her mouth, silently urging her to stay quiet. We crouched there, huddled in the kitchen, listening as the intruder moved through the living room, their heavy footsteps shaking the floorboards. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, the adrenaline coursing through my body, making it hard to think straight. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and a deafening silence settled over the house. I held my breath, straining to hear any sign of movement, any indication of where the intruder might be. Just when I thought we might have a chance to make a break for it, a loud bang echoed from the hallway, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Lily let out a muffled scream, and I tightened my grip on her, praying that the intruder wouldn't hear. But it was too late. Thundering footsteps were headed straight for us, and I could feel the blood draining from my face as I realized our hiding spot had been compromised. As the figure rounded the corner, I caught a glimpse of their face, a middle-aged man with wild eyes and a crazed expression. He spotted us immediately, a twisted grin spreading across his features. I opened my mouth to scream, to call for help, but the words caught in my throat. Lily was trembling beside me, her eyes wide with terror. Suddenly, the unmistakable wail of police sirens pierced the air, and the intruder's expression shifted from one of predatory delight to sheer panic. Without a moment's hesitation, he turned and fled, disappearing down the hallway and out the back door. Lily and I sat there, stunned, as the sirens grew louder and the flashing lights of the police cars filled the windows. It was over, we had survived, but the sheer weight of what had just happened threatened to crush us. When our mum finally burst through the front door, her face a mask of pure relief and concern, we collapsed into her arms, our bodies racked with sobs. She held us tight, whispering soothing words as the police officers swarmed the house, searching for any sign of the intruder. In the aftermath, we learned that the man had been wanted for a series of break-ins in the neighborhood, and that our quick thinking and call to the authorities had likely saved us from a much more sinister fate. But the scars of that day would linger, a permanent reminder of the fragility of the safety we had always taken for granted. As I lay in bed that night, my mind racing with a million haunting thoughts, I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if the police hadn't arrived when they did. Would we have become the next victims in the intruder's twisted game? The very thought sent a chill down my spine. But in the end, we were alive, we were safe, and that was all that mattered. The experience had shaken us to our core, but it had also forged an unbreakable bond between Lily and me. We had faced the darkness together and emerged stronger for it. And as for the intruder, well, I hope he was rotting in a cell somewhere, his twisted dreams of terrorizing innocent families forever shattered. Because if he ever dared to cross our path again, I knew that Lily and I would be ready, our resolve hardened by the trauma we had endured. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me blissfully alone in the cozy confines of our suburban house. As I settled onto the couch, my mind already drifting off to the latest binge-worthy series, a sudden loud crash from the backyard jolted me back to full alertness. My heart pounding, I crept over to the kitchen window, peering out cautiously into the inky darkness. At first, I couldn't make out anything, the dim porch light offering little in the way of illumination. But then I saw it, a shadowy figure lurking near the back gate, their movements furtive and frantic. Panic gripped me as I realized someone had broken into our yard, and they were likely trying to find a way inside the house. Without a moment's hesitation, I reached for the light switch, flooding the backyard with a warm golden glow. There in the sudden brightness, I could see the intruder clearly, a scruffy-looking man, his face half obscured by a hoodie, as he frantically tried the locked gate. His head snapped up as the light flooded the area, and our eyes met for a brief, terrifying moment. Thinking quickly, I reached for the nearest thing I could find, a heavy ceramic vase that had been sitting on the kitchen counter. Gripping it tightly, I moved towards the window, my hands trembling but my resolve unwavering. "I have a gun, and I'm not afraid to use it," I shouted, my voice surprisingly steady despite the fear coursing through me. "Get off my property, or I'll blow your head off." The intruder froze, his eyes widening with a mixture of shock and terror. For a heartbeat, we just stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then, without a word, he turned and bolted, disappearing into the shadows of the backyard. I stood there, vase still clutched in my hands, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. Had I really just done that? Threatened an armed intruder with a weapon I didn't even possess. The adrenaline was still coursing through me, making it hard to think clearly. Slowly, I set the vase back on the counter, my legs shaking as I moved. I had to call the police, had to report what had just happened. But as I reached for the phone, a new wave of panic washed over me. What if the intruder came back? What if he figured out I was bluffing, that I didn't actually have a gun? The thought of him bursting through the back door, hell-bent on revenge, made my blood run cold. Gripped by indecision, I found myself pacing the kitchen, my eyes darting from the window to the door and back again. I had to do something, had to secure the house and make sure I was safe. But the fear was paralyzing, making it hard to think straight. Finally, I settled on a plan. Grabbing a kitchen knife, I moved through the house, locking every door and window I could find. I even wedged a heavy chair under the doorknob, just in case the intruder decided to try his luck again. Once I was satisfied that the house was as secure as it could be, I retreated to the living room, curling up on the couch with the knife clutched tightly in my hand. My eyes were glued to the windows, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, every creak and groan of the old house setting my nerves on edge. I jumped at every passing car, every distant sound, convinced that the intruder was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the familiar sound of my parents' car pulling into the driveway reached my ears. Relief flooded through me, and I scrambled to the front door, throwing it open as they approached. The looks on their faces went from surprise to concern as they took in my disheveled appearance and the knife in my hand. I quickly explained what had happened, watching as their expressions shifted from shock to a mixture of pride and fear. They ushered me inside, locking the door behind them, and immediately called the police to report the incident. As we waited for the authorities to arrive, my parents held me close, assuring me that everything was going to be okay. In the end, the police found no trace of the intruder, and the investigation yielded little in the way of leads. But the experience had left an indelible mark on me, a stark reminder of the fragility of the safety and security we so often take for granted. As I lay in bed that night, my mind racing with a million anxious thoughts, I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't taken that bold, impulsive action. Would the intruder have breached the house, intent on God knows what? The very thought scared me. But in the end, I knew that I had done what I had to do to protect myself, to defend my home and my family. And while the fear and the trauma of that night would linger for a long time to come, I also felt a sense of pride and resilience that I hadn't known I possessed. I was no longer just a kid home alone, vulnerable and afraid. I was a survivor, someone who had faced down a threat and emerged victorious, if only by the skin of my teeth. And that knowledge, that newfound strength, would be my armor as I navigated the uncertain waters of the world beyond the safety of these four walls. Thank you all for listening in. If you haven't already, then please like and subscribe and help this new channel grow. It's free and means a lot.